My spiteful mother-in-law called me a trophy wife at her wedding anniversary and said cruel things about my miscarriage. Her husband shocked everyone, and now she's paying for her actions. My husband, Mark, and I have been together for almost 8 years. We're happily married, but our relationship with his parents has always been filled with conflict. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law has disliked me from the very start. Phil, my father-in-law, was a kind man, but he always let his wife take charge and preferred to stay out of the way. Mark grew up in a wealthier family compared to mine, and his mother always saw that as a reason to look down on me. From the beginning, she made it clear that my middle-class background was somehow wrong. She'd comment on my appearance, my clothes, or my shoes. I used to feel confident about my style and dressed appropriately no matter who I was meeting, but that wasn't enough for her. Because of her constant remarks, I started buying expensive clothes just for visits with her, hoping she'd stop judging me. One time, I wore a white blouse she'd seen me in a month earlier, and she immediately pointed out that I was wearing the same thing twice, adding that, "Well-off people don't do that." She sneered and said I should be ashamed. Mark tried to stop her, but she deliberately made those comments in front of others to embarrass me. She even forced me to go shopping with her and bought me clothes I didn't like. Still, I accepted her gifts with genuine gratitude. I always tried to build a good relationship with her, truly believing she'd come around eventually, but things only got worse. It soon became clear that her generosity came with strings attached. When Mark and I had been dating for less than a year, I landed a job at a great company, which significantly improved my lifestyle. Mark was thrilled for me, but when his mother found out, she was visibly upset. She started calling and texting me, demanding to know exactly how much I earned because, in her words, women in their family should always make less than the men. That insulted me, and I pointed out that in the long run, I'd probably out-earn Mark since I work in the pharmaceutical industry, which pays well. Then she insisted I could work in that field until we got married, but after the wedding, I'd have to quit so the rest of the family wouldn't say Mark couldn't provide for us. That conversation made me laugh. It's not the 1950s, and Mark never had an issue with my job or income. I decided to talk to Mark directly and tell him how his mother was making me uncomfortable. He was furious that she'd been contacting me about it. I don't know what he said to her, but soon after, she called me, screaming and sobbing. She accused me of trying to turn her son against her, called me the devil incarnate, and said she'd never let Mark marry someone like me. She told me to leave him. I ended the call and blocked her number because her toxic behavior was exhausting me. That was the first major red flag. Of course, Mark and I didn't break up, but it made me wonder what kind of mother had raised him. Unfortunately, I couldn't completely cut her off since I had to attend family events where Mark was invited, and she'd be there too. She completely ignored me, acting like I didn't exist. For example, at Mark's cousin's birthday, everyone greeted us both, but she'd rush to hug Mark and ask about his day. If he tried to include me in the conversation, she'd look away and change the subject. I started noticing a pattern. She'd always bring up her health problems, telling Mark how she was getting old and frail, hinting that she might die one day and he needed to take care of her more. But she had no real health issues. She was perfectly fine. It was strange to watch her manipulate her son for emotional attention. Years later, when Mark proposed, he invited everyone to our engagement party. My parents and grandparents were overjoyed, but I can't say the same for his parents. My mother-in-law showed up with a sour look that darkened when she saw the ring on my finger. She started telling Mark it was disrespectful to buy me a bigger ring than the one she'd gotten from Phil. Phil tried to calm her down and begged her not to make a scene, but she kept complaining that her son never did anything nice for her, only for this poor girl. That infuriated me, and I told her that if she couldn't respect me, she needed to leave. She was stunned, but I wasn't going to let her ruin the happiest day of my life in front of my whole family. Phil escorted her out while she kept yelling something at Mark. Later, she called him to apologize, claiming she'd been drunk, though we all knew she'd barely had a glass of wine. Since she apologized to both of us, we let it go. Then came the wedding planning. My mother-in-law insisted on being involved in picking my dress, saying it was her dream. By then, my patience with her was wearing thin, but she was my fiancé's mother, and I couldn't openly disrespect her, so I agreed to let her come. I warned my mom and cousin to brace for her antics. Sure enough, she found fault with my dress, saying refined women don't wear so much lace and demanding I pick a more traditional white gown. I refused, and my mom told her I wasn't her daughter, so she should keep her opinions to herself. My mother-in-law got mad and sulked in the corner like a child, arms crossed. During the fittings, she kept making snide remarks about every dress I tried on. I picked one anyway and paid for it. Then she came up to me and said she was glad I chose that dress because it made my arms look fat, and she laughed. My mom, who had shown incredible patience up to that point, started yelling at her, scolding her for her immature behavior. I was on the verge of tears because no one wants to hear something like that about their wedding dress, especially since I'm not overweight, and I couldn't understand why she'd say such a thing. We made it clear she'd have to find her own way home since I was driving everyone else that day. I knew if she rode with us, she'd keep saying nasty things to me in the car. My mother-in-law panicked, insisting I couldn't just leave her like that, but that's exactly what I did. While I was driving my mom home, Mark called me. He started asking how I could do that to his mother, saying she'd called him in tears, accusing me of abandoning her on purpose. I told him I'd explain everything when I got home, but he kept reprimanding me. My mom, who overheard everything since the call was on speaker, stepped in. She told him he had no idea how his mother had acted all day, listing every detail of her behavior step by step. She ended by asking Mark if he thought that's how grown adults should act. Clearly, Mark felt ashamed since he hadn't heard the full story. His mother, of course, hadn't told him the truth. Later, when Mark got home, he apologized to me again. He said he panicked, thinking his elderly mother was left alone, and that's why he reacted that way. I told him I'd never have done it if she hadn't been awful all day. Mark hugged me and said he'd understand if I wanted to uninvite her from our wedding. At that moment, I wanted nothing more, but I worried Phil wouldn't come if his wife wasn't invited. She'd never allow it. I couldn't imagine my husband's parents missing our wedding. It felt too harsh. We decided to talk to Phil before the wedding and told him that if she started acting up, he'd have to take her out. He understood and assured us he knew what we were dealing with. I felt sorry for poor Phil. He had to handle her 24/7. At the wedding, my mother-in-law was surprisingly well behaved. She kept bragging to everyone about what a grand ceremony we had, as if she'd paid for something. In reality, it was all funded from our joint wedding savings. But since Mark came from a well-off family, and given her habit of exaggerating, his relatives assumed she and Phil might have footed the bill. During the wedding toast, though, Phil made it crystal clear they hadn't contributed a dime. It was all our effort. He also said how proud he was to have such a smart daughter-in-law, and that he couldn't have dreamed his son would find someone like me. Later, guests congratulated us, amazed we'd managed the costs ourselves. My mother-in-law's face grew darker, and she was obviously furious with Phil. During the father-daughter dance, I danced with my dad to the guests' applause. Mark was about to step in next when his mother rushed over, declaring she had to be the first woman to dance with her. "Baby boy!" Mark agreed, and they danced. Later, she came up to me to congratulate me. I smiled politely, and then she said out of nowhere, "I was wrong. Your arms don't look that fat in this dress," before walking off like nothing happened. It really ticked me off, but I refused to let her jabs ruin my perfect day. Everyone had a great time. We danced late into the night, and maybe overdid it with the drinks. The next morning, I woke up to several messages from my mother-in-law. Imagine my shock when I read that, according to her, I'd humiliated her throughout the wedding and needed to try harder if I wanted to be part of her family. I had a slight headache from the celebration, but I clearly remembered everything from the night before. So, I called my parents to ask if I'd done anything embarrassing. They assured me I hadn't. I'd been great, and everyone had a wonderful time. When Mark woke up, I showed him the messages. He told me to just ignore them, which made me suspicious. I pressed him to explain what she meant. Then Mark admitted she'd come up to him all night, complaining that I was having too much fun. If I danced with my cousins, she called me loose and told him he needed to control me now that I was married. Mark said it in a joking way, adding that he'd brushed off her comments and I should too. But it offended me. How could she imply something like that when I was just dancing with my relatives at my own wedding? She had no right to talk about me that way. I wanted to confront her right then, but Mark and I were about to leave for our honeymoon, so I put it off. Our honeymoon was amazing. We had a fantastic time. The day we got back, my mother-in-law called me, all sugary sweet, asking how it went. It was weird since she almost never calls me. I told her I didn't appreciate how she'd talked about me to Mark on our wedding day. She brushed it off, saying she didn't mean anything by it, then started prying into details about our honeymoon, hinting about whether we'd had enough alone time. I asked her to just say what she meant since I didn't think our honeymoon was her business. Then she said she just wanted to know if I was going to be a mother anytime soon. I nearly gagged at her words, and for two reasons. First, I'd only been married a week, and she was already expecting me to turn into a baby factory for her grandmother dreams. Second, Mark and I didn't want kids yet. We discussed it long before we got serious, and our stance hadn't changed. I stayed quiet while she kept pushing, saying I needed to get pregnant soon because my biological clock was ticking and these were my best childbearing years. I was so uncomfortable listening to her ramble that I could barely hold it together. But she went further, saying Mark and I should stop using contraception. That was completely out of line. I cut her off and told her I wasn't continuing the conversation. When I told Mark, he was livid. He called her right away to give her a piece of his mind and bluntly told her we weren't planning on kids yet. My mother-in-law's reaction was predictable. She started screaming and acting like we'd killed her dog. She threatened that if Mark didn't give her a grandchild, she'd leave him nothing in her will. Mark laughed and reminded her she didn't have any assets to leave since she and Phil had a prenup, so her threat was empty. Then she turned her rage on me, blaming me for everything. She declared that my only duty as a woman was to give my husband a child, and I couldn't even manage that. She started hurling words like useless, which cut deep. Mark told her to stop, but she kept insulting me, claiming we'd ruined her lifelong dream. She even said if we didn't want kids, why did we bother getting married? Finally, Mark put an end to it. He told her he'd had enough, and she needed to shut up. He made it clear he wouldn't let her talk about me like that anymore, and that, after years of her belittling me, he was done. She tried to defend herself, but Mark said he was cutting her off completely. She was no longer welcome in our home or our lives. He warned her that if she showed up uninvited, we'd call the police and embarrass her in front of the neighbors, knowing how much she cared about her reputation. We've stuck to that since then and have had no contact with her. Phil tried to intervene once, but after talking to Mark and hearing the full story, he supported our decision. Over time, my parents and Phil have met up several times, but we never invited her. Thankfully, she's respected our boundaries. Last December, I got pregnant by accident. We were shocked since it wasn't planned, but we were in a good place in life and decided we could handle it. When the news spread, people started congratulating us. My mother-in-law sent a bouquet of flowers and an apology letter, saying she'd reflected on her behavior and had changed after years of therapy. I didn't respond because I still doubted her sincerity. But 2 months into the pregnancy, I lost the baby. It happened at night. I froze when I saw the blood. I woke Mark up in tears, and he rushed me to the nearest hospital. There, we got the bad news. It was devastating because even though we hadn't planned it, we'd already fallen in love with that little one and would have done anything for them. I didn't know how to cope with the grief. Mark and my parents were there for me the whole time. Phil and Mark's family called to check on us and even stopped by to offer support. My mom stayed at our house for a few days because she knew I was too heartbroken to even get out of bed. Everything inside me hurt, and I'd cry for hours. Mark was my rock, and little by little, I started to feel better. Last week, Phil invited us to their 25th wedding anniversary. It was a big family event, and everyone was invited. Mark and I didn't want to go. We knew the miscarriage would come up, and it was too painful to relive the worst day of our lives for everyone. But Phil begged us to come, saying he wanted to spend time with us, and that we needed a night to unwind. Reluctantly, we agreed. It would be our first time seeing my mother-in-law in years, but I was already in such a fragile emotional state that I didn't have the energy to worry about her or her antics. She was pleasantly surprised to see Mark at the party and rushed to hug him. With me, she was cold, but I didn't care. I found a seat and left Mark to talk to her. Later, during dinner, everyone shared good news and updates, as usual at family gatherings. One of Mark's cousins mentioned she was pregnant, and it hit me like a punch to the heart. As everyone congratulated her, my mother-in-law stood up to give a toast. Microphone in hand, she raised her glass and started talking about how wonderful it was to be surrounded by loved ones, and how she wouldn't change a thing. Then she congratulated Mark's cousin on her pregnancy, saying she was bringing a little bundle of joy into the world, while others kill their babies. She stared right at me and went on, saying she knew I'd done something to the child because miscarriages don't just happen. Mark and I froze, unable to believe how cruel she could be. She kept going, loudly declaring that her son had ended up with someone like me, and that she'd only let him marry me hoping for grandkids, but I couldn't even manage that. She called me a trophy wife, and said she couldn't wait for Mark to divorce me, so no one would have to see me at her next anniversary. Then she downed her glass like she'd just given a victory speech. The room went silent until Mark asked his mother what the hell she was doing. They started arguing, her accusing me, him defending me with everything he had, calling her behavior absurd and disgusting. I was so humiliated and crushed that I broke down crying. It was too much. I couldn't handle it. She smirked and said I should stop putting on a show because no one would buy my pitiful story. Then, out of nowhere, Phil, who'd been sitting quietly, watching it all, stood up and asked everyone to calm down. He said he had something important to get off his chest. Taking the microphone, he announced that he'd been miserable for the last 25 years, and that tonight, his eyes had finally opened. He wasn't going to take it anymore. He looked at his wife, who sat there stunned, and declared there wouldn't be another anniversary because he didn't want to be married to her anymore. Her face looked like she'd been hit with a brick. Phil went on, saying he'd stayed in the marriage with a woman like her all those years just for Mark, to give him a good example and keep the family together. But watching his wife's behavior over all these years, and seeing how she kept hurting those around her, Phil realized he was too old to put up with it anymore. My mother-in-law looked shell-shocked. Phil didn't ask the guests to enjoy their meal. Instead, he said he was stepping out for a drink. He took off his jacket and tie and left the party. She screamed for him to come back, but he ignored her. Then she turned her anger on me, claiming I was to blame for everything and had ruined it all. Mark told her it was entirely her fault, and that he was glad his father was finally leaving her. Those words must have hit her hard because she went silent, then announced to everyone that she was leaving too. A few guests came over to check on me, worried about how I was holding up. Mark's pregnant cousin hugged me too. After that incident, Phil moved in with us. He refused to go back home, even though my mother-in-law keeps calling him 100 times a day. He told us he's getting a divorce lawyer. I feel terrible because I can't shake the thought that somehow this is my fault. Am I to blame for Phil divorcing my husband's mother? Update 1. I didn't expect my story to get such a huge response when I posted it. So many people shared their own experiences with toxic mothers-in-law. It's honestly shocking. I can't wrap my head around how some parents act this way. I also want to clarify. Please don't blame my husband. He stood up for me as much as he could. It's not easy for him to deal with a controlling, toxic mother. I'm lucky to have grown up in a loving family. He wasn't so fortunate. Clearly, he grew up thinking her behavior was normal, but he's done everything to protect me. Lastly, I want to thank everyone who shared their miscarriage stories. I genuinely feel for every woman who's gone through it. It's hard to admit, but I feel overwhelming guilt, like it was my job to protect my baby. I did everything I could, yet I still blame myself, even though it wasn't my fault. You're right, I need to see a therapist. I'm also joining online forums where other moms share their experiences with this kind of loss to find support and understanding. Update 2. Phil's filed for divorce. It's been 2 months since my last update, and Phil's been living with us. He's a great houseguest. I can see where Mark gets his sense of humor. Phil loves cooking too, so sometimes I come home from work to dinner already made. My mother-in-law was so lucky to have him, and I don't get how she let herself lose someone like that. When Phil and Mark went to serve her the divorce papers, she wouldn't even look at them. Mark told me she yelled, claiming they had no right to cut her out, and that everything she said about me was just because she wanted the best for our family. Mark ignored her and helped Phil pack his things. She got furious, throwing stuff on the floor and screaming. At that point, Phil threatened to call the police since it was his house. She went quiet because she knew she had nowhere else to go. After the anniversary fiasco, none of the guests have reached out to her except to tell her what an awful person she is. Everyone knew she lied about me being a trophy wife. I have a solid career and earn well. They also understood my pain over losing the baby. Naturally, they turned their anger on her, making it clear they didn't want to deal with someone so unstable. She's lost her family and friends because of her outbursts. She's tried begging Phil to come back, but he's clearly done. My parents talked to her after hearing what she said about me and warned her they'd sue for public defamation. My mom's not one to stay quiet. She let her have it. Knowing my parents, I'm sure they'll follow through with a lawsuit if they have to. I just hope she stays away from me. Update 3. Thank you to everyone who supported me through this. It's been 8 months since my last update. Phil's officially a free man now. He and my mother-in-law had a prenup, so she couldn't claim anything. Still, Phil agreed to give her all the money from their joint account and let her keep the car. She was furious and demanded the house too, but Phil and his lawyer just laughed. Turns out the house was his before they even got married. Mark heard she's staying with one of his cousins while she looks for affordable housing. In my opinion, she has enough money to live comfortably on her own. She mostly keeps her distance from us, though we occasionally hear she's trying to spin her version of the story to get sympathy. Well, good luck with that. As for us, we're happy. Things are great with Mark and me. I did start therapy like I mentioned, and it's helped me make new friends who really get me. Mark's also started seeing a therapist to work through his past. Our careers are going strong too, and we're just grateful for everything we have.